Hey guys, welcome back to the Hardcore World. In this episode, we should be able to finish up the main exterior of the cathedral. There's still going to be some details and stuff that we haven't gotten done. I don't think we're going to put the glass in the windows or put a lot of the chains that are supposed to be in front of some of the windows. But we are going to get, just the main structure of the cathedral done in this episode, and I'm super excited because this will have been the biggest project I've ever done in Minecraft for sure. And I'm super happy with how it's turning out. I already finished finished building up in the creative testing world, so I know this thing looks sick when it's done. So I think that's what we're gonna do in this episode, and I think we're really just gonna focus on the cathedral in this episode, and not really do too much else. In any case, before we get on with some work on the cathedral, I'd really appreciate it if you guys would go down and check to see if you're subscribed, and do so if you're not already. And if you want to help me out, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video. Anyway, I think what we're going to do now is hop into stream highlight mode and finish up the outside of this cathedral, and then we'll kind of fly around a bunch, have some fancy b-roll shots with the shaders on, and I'll explain some of the finer details of how I designed this thing. So yeah, let's crack on with that. Alrighty, and that is that. The cathedral is pretty much complete, for the most part. Obviously, there's tons of details we still need to do. There's some, little towers over here and, a little dude out on the top that we need to build. But for the most part, this thing is structurally complete, which I'm super excited about. Man, this thing is such a large build, and it feels good to have it done. And now, hopefully, we can work on some of the finer details of this world and really start to make it feel alive. And first thing on the list is going to be to tear that ugly house down. But I'm really happy with the time scale of this build and how it's going. The inside of this thing is going to be a whole different beast that will probably take, another 2 or 3 episodes all on its own. Because right now it is just a massive empty area. So that will be in a couple weeks, but I want to take a couple weeks off of the cathedral build and just do some, housekeeping around the world. And we'll keep putting in little details and stuff, but for the most part, I want to do more stuff like this all over the place with more details and more small builds to kind of start to develop a bit of a kingdom around here. And yeah. Why don't we turn on some shaders and have some really pretty b-roll shots. We'll have some music in the background and have some really nice cinematic shots of this thing now that it's finally somewhat complete. It's hard to convey the sheer scale of this thing while also showing all of it, because from the ground here, you can only really see one little part of it at a time. But my goodness, this is a large build. And yeah, coming along to the side here, and this thing, imagine if you were an actual Minecraft character and you were just walking around, and there's just this massive cathedral here out in the middle of literal nowhere. No other structures other than basic little villager houses within an infinite number of blocks. Pretty insane stuff. So why don't we talk about my build process of making this thing for a little bit. Let's hop over to the creative testing world, and I will be able to show you a little bit more accurately what I was thinking when I designed this thing. So this isn't my first cathedral that I've ever built in Minecraft of this scale. In one of my older hardcore worlds, I designed this thing, which is very similar but also very different at the same time. This was my first crack at a build of this scale, and I think I did a lot of things right, but I also did a lot of things wrong. Like, I feel like this first level was the part I was most disappointed with. I really didn't like how this looked, because I couldn't quite get the curves I wanted out of, the smaller sections of the cathedral. So when I was building this one, I kept that in mind and made sure just to really focus on the curves. Because Minecraft is such a square game, you want to avoid very, very obvious shapes like I used here, and instead go for slightly more intricate, layered looks like this is what I found to be kind of the solution. Because there were really no curves, there were just geometric shapes like, essentially the shape here is a triangle, the shape here is a circle, semicircle. Whereas here, it's hard to explain, but it's a little bit more of an actual arch that looks self-supporting and very layered. It has multiple layers coming out, not just a doorway, but a doorway inside of a doorway inside of a doorway inside of a doorway, giving you this really cool layered look. And one other thing I wanted to avoid was just making it super square. Like in this cathedral, I had these very, very, very square pillars up here, or square spires, I should say. And that's why I really like these spires, because they avoid that square look by being this kind of octagonal shape. And taking on these partially diagonal sections are very challenging, but they really enhance the build a whole lot. Same with like this big dome section. Having these diagonal sections really helps take away from the squareness of Minecraft. Obviously, the main section of the cathedral here is just this repeating pattern of windows, but if you'll see over on the old design, my first attempt at a cathedral, this side was not, I never finished this one since I died in that hardcore world, but the sides are much less interesting on this one. Obviously, I didn't build the flying buttresses or anything yet, but I didn't like how these windows ended up looking. And part of that is just experimenting with different shapes until you find one that you really like, such as the shape over there that I found with the new cathedral, that I really like a lot better. Again, some of this is hard to explain, but what I would keep in mind is, with the arches like this, the larger the arches are, the more freedom you have to get the curves you want. For example, this curve right here I really like, but this curve right here, I didn't really like the look of these windows, because the very tip of this window is 2 blocks wide, which isn't optimal for allowing, the most freedom for that size. So when I was designing this one, I decided that the base, the very tip of the window, should be 1 block wide instead, allowing kind of more freedom to have a peak in a very narrow window. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is if you want the windows to peak nicely, thin windows will definitely have to be 1 wide at the top, and so you have to kind of keep in mind that the general size of a section like this has to be an odd number of blocks, so that you can allow the center to be 1 block instead of 2. Now, the main difference between this build and this build, other than some of the more subtle shapes, is the palette. I like the palette a lot better on this build. I think the roof blocks here are a little bit contrasty and they don't work super well together, but I think the roof blocks are okay. The main thing I really didn't like about this build was the main blocks here in the structure. Obviously, I'm using a texture pack, so if I turn off the texture pack, it's slightly less contrasty and a little bit less in your face. But I still was not a fan of how this thing looked with default textures. It just looked a little bit too patchy. I don't know. It just doesn't look as pleasing to the eyes as this palette does. But when I'm designing builds like this, what I like to do is just plan out the palette by building a little wall here, right? Like, I've done this with so many builds. Whenever I'm testing out a new palette, I always say, what blocks will work together? Let me try building up a wall with them and seeing how I like the palette. And what I was thinking about when I was making this is, what white blocks blocks can I use to add a little bit more texture and variety, right? Because you don't just want white, or I didn't for this build, because I wanted it to be more interesting. I wanted it to look kind of corroded and old. I wanted it to look kind of like patchy and aged. But I also didn't want it to look quite as patchy as this. This almost just looks like some weird cobbled together, science fair project. Whereas I think what really pulled this palette together was the pastel colors, right? Because this is white terracotta, this is smooth sandstone, and this is white concrete, but none of them actually look white because the smooth quartz here and the quartz bricks ended up being the more white block, and since they're the majority, they kind of take over as the primary color of the build. So then contrasting that with these other blocks that might look white on their own, other than I think smooth sandstone definitely looks quite yellowish on its own, but if you look at white terracotta on its own, it definitely looks very white. But contrasted with even more white blocks, such as the quartz, it ends up looking very pink, and the white concrete ends up looking very blue, and of course the smooth sandstone looks very yellow. But because they're such subtle colors, it ends up looking very pastel and pretty. Like, I don't know, it's those pastel colors are very pleasing to the eye, and that's kind of what I was thinking when I designed this thing. And then obviously, that's supposed to look like some kind of like limestone, or I don't know, some kind of very light colored stone that kind of has, differences in colors, but still a very pastel aesthetic. Now, of course, the roof blocks are pretty self-explanatory. A prismarine palette looks very much like a corroded copper, kind of like the new copper blocks in 1.17, without actually having to use them. But I added in these warped planks because I wanted it a little bit more of a darker, crusty patches, almost looking like it's really starting to rust. There's these kind of like lines that almost look like there's, strips peeling off. And of course, I really like the diamond ore in this build. It was partially just a flex, but it was partially because I really like the look of kind of that stone with just a little bit of this kind of light blue greenish color, because I think it looks like this is more like a normal piece of stone that had some kind of prismarine coating on it that's starting to wear off, and there's just little patches of it left. But over here, like maybe this is what the roof originally looked like, and then it starts to wear out into starts to get corroded and kind of crack in the form of this prismarine, and then maybe, it gets corroded even more, and some of the prismarine starts to wear off, and it looks like this diamond ore, and then, of course, the starts to really crack and peel and looks like these warped planks. So I think keep in mind what these blocks do for the build, not so much what they do within the Minecraft universe, because obviously prismarine, diamond ore, and warped planks have nothing to do with each other, within the larger Minecraft universe. In this build, they kind of tell a story of why we have this kind of patchwork, and I think they complement each other really nicely. But that's some of the stuff I was thinking about when I designed this build, and if you have any questions about how I decided to do certain elements, let me know in the comments. We'll definitely talk about it more as we finish the build, add in the windows, add in some more buttresses, add in some, some of this stuff that I haven't built up in the survival world. We'll definitely talk about it more, but for now, I'm pretty happy with that. And now we're back in the hardcore world, and I think that's going to do it for this episode. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Thank you for coming along on this journey that is far from being over, but at least we've reached a major milestone, and I think it's time to start doing some other details around our world as we work on this thing in the background. So thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe if you aren't already, and like the video if you enjoyed. It really helps me out. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.